always hear it when it's up loud.
Yeah, it's like the Applebee's mix, you know. What do you hear with everybody going? You hear the snare and the vocal or something like that.
Yeah.
Big fan of that too. Questions on that calibration kind of thing, sort of.
There's one that.
Go ahead. Oh, someone. Adam.
Yep. Just expanding on what you were saying, just changing perspective. You know, whether it's volume perspective or different speakers or even laptop speakers. I like to hear it from another room. You know, sometimes walk around, you know, I have a studio in my house, so I'll walk around the house and maybe be on the other side of a door. Somebody turned me on to years ago, like once you get to a certain level in a mix, like, you know, you could be reading a magazine or doing something else and then have the track play, so that changes your focus, and then something might stand out in a way where you're not focusing on specific details. So change in perspective I find really helpful.
Keeping the tracks in loop.
Keeping them in loop, you said?
Yeah, sometimes.
Focusing on a specific thing.
Or
avoiding them. Right.
I was going to see what people's opinions were on like getting your computer screen away from the monitors, because I've done a lot of just it being in the middle, or just like pulling it down to where like it's actually causing neck problems, but like having it so I'm just really, you know, listening to the music and not having this reflective surface. I mean, just what people think about.
You mean acoustically or distraction?
Well, both. I mean, like shutting my eyes when I'm monitoring, like, you know, I just like hear it in a different way. Like I can pay attention to the music more. Whereas if I'm looking at a graphical representation of music, I don't feel like I'm listening to things. I feel like I'm looking at them. You know.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Matt?
I was gonna say, when I have a band track in here and they come back to listen to the playback, I always like to shut the monitor off.
Right.
Because they want to watch the waveforms and judge their performance based on what they're saying. But if I turn it off, they're like, oh yeah, okay, we're gonna listen. And then they snap to it, and really, the important things stick out that way.
Right. But what about also like that piece of glass being there, like, you know, opinions?
I don't have a problem.
You don't think it's reflecting?
Maybe it is.
Yeah.
No, on that, the monitor, if you can pull it up, and this really only works if you're doing near field, if you can pull your monitor up to where it's even with the corners of the inside corners of the speakers, the angle that hits it is going to be less likely to bounce it back in your face. It's going to go this way.
Right, so it's not going to create a weird center.
It actually, I find sometimes it can reinforce the center for the same reason that baffling around a microphone can do interesting things to the microphone. But if you want to keep it from bouncing back on you, just pull it up so it's right along. It starts to act as a soffit to some extent. A little bit of that with your near field monitors.
These are great conversations because there's so much science that we will all talk about personally one-to-one and also in here, and go in 1,000 different studios of people that we admire that just create the most ridiculous recordings or mixes or whatever that have stuff that's just blatantly the opposite of what we say in here every day, all day.
I have a story about that. I once walked into this huge studio, big SSL console and stuff, and the guy had a couple of NS10s. Instead of being, you know, pointing towards him, he had them kind of straight against the console, and it sounded great.
Right. It's interesting. It's like it could be just knowing the room and knowing the comb filtering of that spot and going, well, if I angle it here, this knob's gonna break out so and so. I did some mastering at Bernie Grunman a couple of years ago, and there's a guy named Brian Big Bass Gardner, the mastering engineer over there, and has a couple of KRKs. He's got his main mastering monitors, but his KRKs are literally on the floor under his desk. Like the desk is full on like blocking the speakers, and he's like, you know, how does it feel when I'm not paying attention, and there's all this modes going on with the desk and stuff. But that's kind of in line with what you're saying is the approach of I tend to mix music and email a lot, because it's when I'm distracted and I turn around on my laptop and I'm like, oh, what the, you know, I haven't heard that in 4 hours focusing on the thing, and it's like all of a sudden this thing sticks out because of that email. So I think that's similar.
I just turn my back to the mix, to the monitors and the speakers and everything. I just turn around. Actually, I realized after doing that my ears aren't as balanced as I thought they were, because sometimes like the snare will be sounding perfectly level, you know, perfect level, exactly
Right.
where I want. I'll turn around, and it's in the other ear, and it's sounding completely wrong. So I do that, and then I'm not paying attention to the screen. That seems to help.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of turning off the screen.
Yep.
I think that
I am too.
changes everything.
Back and forth.
Yeah, you focus on completely different things. And walking down the room, going down the hall.
I tend to, instead of turning the entire screen off, I'll actually collapse the window and there's like some pretty picture and I'm like, oh, cool, yeah, I can buy one.
One
Sorry.
thing I've noticed, especially because I tend to mix in a room that's nowhere near being tuned or perfectly acoustically in line, is that, especially with smaller format speakers, that where I'm sitting, like, might not be really, you know, like you mix something, you go listen to it, and you're like, oh my god, that kick is huge, or I can't hear the kick, or the bass is whack. You gotta find that, like, I find I have to find a spot that's kind of over here in the corner, where I like can go and I can kind of feel the pulse of the kick and the bass, and like knowing that spot where I can just get up and feel that,
Right.
has made my perception of where things are a lot better.
Right.
Because I think a lot of people are dealing with that kind of environment.
Yeah, if you have a small room, you're sitting in the middle of it, you get no bass love. It's awful.
Right. The middle of
Yeah.
the room is usually the worst spot to sit. Chris?
Just like, well, you were saying this earlier about like changing perspective, and I found like one thing that helps me a lot is to walk away from the mix for like an hour, because if you take a song that I really like and you put it on speakers and you give it like a 6 dB bump at 1K, I hear it when you do the bump, but if I stick around for like 5 minutes, it sounds totally normal to me. So if I don't get up, like, you know, your ears just like adjust to stuff. Like they'll adjust to like major like frequency problems, and you'll think, oh, that sounds pretty natural. And if you don't like get up and, or if I don't get up and walk away and then come back, you know, sometimes I don't notice it. It's like the frog in the hot water, you know?
Yeah.
Well, your ears also get fatigued. Your ears also get fatigued, so it breaks.
Yeah. Avoiding next day horror syndrome.
Yeah,
What was
it's
it
kind of
thinking?
like the classic thing, you know, you're mixing up until 4 in the morning, and come back, you know, after lunch, completely different thing.
Mhm. What about calibration of levels? Anybody have a particular, are you hate it, you think it's stupid, some people do it, some people don't, mixing at a specific volume level, or 3 specific volume levels without too much variation, etc. Is anybody proponent, opponent?
That's a lot of what I do in my job, is like calibration, acoustic measurements, and that kind of stuff. So like, when I got a subwoofer, I took all that stuff to my room. It was like, sweet, you know, I'm gonna take this $20,000 V&K system and calibrate the shit out of this thing.
Right.
And I did, and like I didn't really like it because I'm sort of a bass fanatic, right? And I know that, so when I calibrated my subwoofer to flat, it's not really fair to what comes out of my room then.
Right.
You know, so like then I just sort of at some point gave it a 3 dB bump because.
So for
that
for mixing or for tracking or
for mixing,
composing?
it accounts for me, you know, my bias of like loving bass. When it sounds good to me, it sounds normal to regular people.
Right.
You know?
So you turn yourself down or up to get more bass? Or
I turn my monitoring up so that what I do is less.
Right on.
You know, because I naturally overcompensate or under. Whatever, I love bass.
Has anybody tried using a drive rack to level a room for mixing?
A drive rack?
Drive rack, yes. DVX unit that's used for tuning PAs and speaker systems, etc. It's similar to the Odyssey system, or there's IK Multimedia ARC or the JBL.
Real-time leveling.
Right. I actually know a really great studio in Los Feliz in LA that tracks famous people all day long every day, and their B room one actually gets used a lot for a lot of the same projects. As it's one of the worst sounding rooms with, it's like a maybe 6 or 7 feet wide little hole with maybe 7 foot ceiling box with Mackie HR 824 8-inch or 7-inch. What are the size of those big monitors in it? Right. Sounds like in that room, and a drive rack PA to tune the room to get that out, and it's been that way for 5 or 6 years that I know of, and go with what works, you know. There's plenty of stuff that they'll argue the science to death is that you can't correct room resonances, reflections, reverberation in the room, etc. with something with EQ, right? But some of the best studios in the world have white EQs or Dolby, room corrections. I'm looking around the room like I know somebody that does that. And if that's your last resort, I think if you can do everything in your room and you spent $1 billion and you just can't fit any other options in your room, you've got to do something, So if it works for you, go for it.
Interesting topic about using pro audio, live pro gear. If you can take, especially if you're doing electronic dance music, anything like that, get a pair of those, get a medium crappy room, and listen to your mix on a live PA if you can, and really take some time to tweak it out. Because working on an album with Artemis right now, and it's amazing. Keith, their producer, was listening on his computer speakers, and he's like, "Yeah, this is sounding great." He comes over, plugs his mix in on a pair of QSC K10s that are in the live room for rehearsal. He put them back on his computer speakers. He said it was a whole new day. It just everything had more presence. There was pop and sizzle that just wasn't there before. And it's just getting a different perspective, I think.
Yeah, you're talking about the importance of multiple monitoring options.
But not in the same room. Getting out, getting.
Be it your car, but even in the same
rent a room at Soundwave or something and go just check it out. And see what's happening.
That's an interesting point, because it's like saying what's the end venue for this music.
Right.
So like an Artemis track, it's a dance track, right?
Right.
It's electronica, but it's going to go that way.
So should you take your mix and bump it down to an MP3 and throw it on your earbuds and pay
listen
attention,
to it in the car.
or get your car, and you know what I mean?
Exactly.
I'm a big fan of the car, because I had this car and I hate the stereo. So if I could get a mix to sound pretty good on that, I was psyched. I'm like, cool, let's master it now.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
I forget who it was, but I was reading an interview with some famous engineer, and he said that when he traveled to different cities, he would also always rent the same car, because it's
right. That's actually one of the reasons I haven't sold the car that I have in so long. It's got like 200,000 miles on it. I'm like, what the heck am I gonna do? Because the stock stereo, and that thing just, I know what's going on. I literally was like, okay, if I make $2 billion next year and I build a house, I'm gonna build a room just to put this car in, so I can just pipe in the audio.